presentation is called People Before Profit, Race, Migration, Trafficking, and the Exploitation of Filipino Migrant Workers. And just to begin, I want to talk a little bit about myself. This is me at the NYC Pride Rally, but I wanted to do research on human trafficking because it's been a field that I've been interested in for 5 years now, and so I've been growing accustomed to the discourse of the anti-trafficking movement of modern-day slavery, what it means to be free, and even though the anti-trafficking movement is growing more traction, especially by the New York Times journalist Nicholas Kristof and NGOs like the Polaris Project, I felt it was kind of leaving out some stories, especially from my personal experience as a Filipina. Growing up as a Filipina in San Jose, I had lots of relatives who were exploited caregivers, who worked as domestic workers, and even had one of my aunts was a mail-order bride. And so even though the human trafficking movement talks a lot about sex trafficking, I felt that it didn't talk about the experiences of Filipino migrant workers. And so I really wanted to use my research as a platform to empower workers and also to document these stories that are rarely heard. And so my research topic discusses how and why Filipino migrant workers have become subject to human trafficking during their migration stories and migration journeys. So I did that through collecting stories from workers all across the nation, more specifically New York City, DC, and New Orleans. And I wanted to analyze what factors facilitated the trafficking of workers throughout their journey. And after I interviewed them, I wanted to assess what their solutions are in terms of community-based solutions to combating human trafficking. Cool. And just so to kind of get you guys all on the same page, because I know human trafficking is a really conflated term, I wanted to talk about what is human trafficking in the first place. So in layman's terms, human trafficking is essentially the trade and commodification of human beings. But if we're looking at it through a legal framework and we're trying to kind of sue a corporation for human trafficking workers, the UN Palermo Protocol defines human trafficking to have 3 parts, which is an act, a means, and a purpose. So the act could be recruitment, transportation, etc., etc. Means could be threats, physical and verbal abuse, and the purpose could be forced slavery, forced labor, sexual exploitation, and prostitution. And so if we're looking at the case of migrant workers and Filipino migrant workers, we can see that the act is recruitment. The means could be threats, deception, or even verbal abuse. And the purpose could be for forced labor in a certain industry. And what does human trafficking have to do with the Filipino context? So I'll be talking a lot about the Philippines Labor Export Policy, which is a set of laws and regulations set up by the Philippine government to encourage its citizens to migrate out of the country and to work in foreign nations. And so the connection between LEP and trafficking is that a lot of workers, if they're forced to migrate, they're going to try and seek opportunities that are hosted by really fraudulent recruitment agencies and could lead to future exploitation in their later migration journey. And these are some workers who are protesting against trafficking. And of course, if we're looking at the migration journey from the Philippines to the United States, we have to talk about the U.S. and their desire for racialized labor. Even if we look at the Atlantic slave trade, labor is racialized in terms of using black, brown bodies as a way to kind of work our land and things like that. And I think this cartoon does a really good job of summing it up. And to talk about racialized labor in the modern day context, I touch upon guest worker programs. And how many of you guys know what guest worker programs are? Or some sort of it? So guest worker programs are a way for the U.S. to kind of seek foreign workers and recruit foreign workers to come into the U.S. To either work in agricultural industries, domestic work, even like the oil rig industry, as I'll talk about later. And so you can see that U.S. labor and immigration policies really intersect with human trafficking and the trafficking of migrant laborers. And so in order to kind of connect with these themes, I worked at the Philippine Forum, which is an NGO nonprofit based in Woodside, Queens, in New York City. And this is me at the center. And so they're really great because they're a grassroots organization and they work with migrant workers from the ground up. So unlike a nonprofit agency that gives out services, they actually work with the workers themselves and campaigns with the workers themselves to fight for their rights and fight for their own empowerment. So during my time in New York, and just in the East Coast in general, I was able to meet some workers. This is like the bottom picture over there is during a Kabalikat meeting, and so Kabalikat was a domestic worker support group in New York City, and so this is just them texting like during the meetings. And I was also able to be a part of their mobilization, and so that picture over there, I was in DC for the 50th anniversary on the March of Washington, and so I mobilized with 15 other traffic teachers from the Philippines, and this is them holding their signs in front of the Lincoln Memorial, which is like unfortunately still in construction, and this is Ate Rana, who was one of the workers I met. I was also able to meet fellow community organizers on the East Coast, participate in campaigns and mobilizations. I had the opportunity to be a part of the Trayvon Martin rallies that happened in New York City, the NYC Pride Parade after the struck down of Doma, and also the March on Washington, which you can see over there. And I'm holding a flag. I was also able to participate in lead educational discussions, such as, for example, one of them was about personal migration and mass campaign work, and also lead an educational discussion on Filipino history for Filipino youth in Jamaica, Queens, and also conduct community research. So I was able to do a separate research project, along with my other research projects, on how the Woodside community viewed or perceives human trafficking in their community. And then lastly, I was able to organize an international conference called IMR4, or the Fourth International Assembly for Migrants and Refugees. And so it was actually a conference that happened last week, and I was in New York. And it was a way for migrants and refugees to gather all over the world to talk about issues like forced migration, family separation, and issues like that. And so every week we would have a meeting and do amazing things and meet delegates from all over the world. So back to my research. So my main research question was, what factors facilitate the trafficking of migrant workers from their migration journey from the Philippines to the United States? So I wanted to form my 4 research questions in order to both track the journey from the Philippines to the US, but also to track the trafficking process from recruitment, or actually home environment, then recruitment, the transit of workers, and then finally their experience in the destination country. So I asked, what are the push and pull factors that encourage migration? How were Filipino migrant workers exploited during the recruitment process? How were they exploited in their workplace in the US? And what were the barriers for Filipino migrant workers in accessing basic resources after they were trying to find help after they're exploited? And finally, what the solutions that they propose to combat trafficking. And this is a helpful kind of infographic to describe what I'm talking about. So it both tracks the migration journey from the Philippines to the US, but also documenting the trafficking process that a lot of scholars talk about in terms of human trafficking. And so I conducted 8 semi-structured interviews, 4 with migrant workers, and 4 with staff members at prominent anti-trafficking organizations in New York City. And each of the interviews were about 45 minutes long. And also most of my data came from cultural sharings, informal gatherings, and just informal conversations with the workers themselves about their migration journey and their experiences. And so the main major finding that I found was that the trafficking of Filipino migrant workers is really a result of unjust global and national policies, both in the Philippines and the United States. And these policies discriminate and abuse migrant workers. And so you can definitely see the impact of these larger policies throughout their migration journey, throughout their decisions, throughout their journey. And because trafficking is facilitated by these large-scale policies, but also you can see the effects of it in their personal decisions, the solutions are best found and best led by migrant workers themselves and in their local communities in order to impact the larger global scale. And so for the next section of my presentation, I organized my presentation in terms of global and then personal, and then you can see the connection to trafficking. So you can kind of see how the global context impacts the personal decisions and personal experiences of migrant workers, just to kind of give you a visual. So starting from the home environment of the Philippines, a lot of the workers felt that a sense of hopelessness in their country. They felt like they had no ways of upward mobility, they had no opportunities to continue their career, and they were also unable to raise their families. And this is in the larger context of LEP, of course, this cultural force of pushing workers out, and also the government's inability to create jobs, so there is no upward mobility that they speak of. And so in order to connect it back to trafficking, because the Philippine government does not invest in social services, workers are forced to migrate and to find work abroad, even though those opportunities may be fraudulent. And see, these are some of the quotes from the workers. And you can tell, I left the Philippines because I wanted to find greener pastures, I wanted to help my kids, but I couldn't because there's nothing left in the Philippines to be developed. In terms of recruitment, when they were trying to find these jobs outside of the Philippines, once again, the global context of LEP and foreign labor recruitment schemes, recruitment agencies would advertise these opportunities in barrios or local neighborhoods. And once these workers find these opportunities, they have to actually pay different fees to recruitment agencies, kind of creating a process of debt bondage to these recruitment workers or recruitment agencies. So even before they enter the workplace, they have to pay numerous fees and have debt bondage to the recruiters. In addition, they were improperly trained. They were improperly trained before going to the United States. And so that means that they had no idea what their rights are. If anything happened to them or if they were in trouble, they wouldn't know where to go to, essentially. And the only thing they can go to is their consulate. And of course, if their consulate is not being responsive, what do? They're kind of just stuck. So I can wrap it up really soon. And so once they're in the U.S., a lot of the workers talked about their experiences in the workplace. So they were often isolated because they couldn't speak the language. They lived in cramped quarters. Often the workers would have to live with 10 to 12 other workers in a really small bunkhouse. And that was all because of a result of the guest worker programs that I was talking about, because the employers are in control of their visas. So of course, there's no way to escape. And that kind of creates the context of human trafficking. And this is a quote from one of the workers. She says that she's more than a slave because the opportunity that she thought would happen in the U.S. didn't really happen for her. And instead, she was treated as basically a slave and less than that. And in terms of access to basic services, because they couldn't speak the language, because they were improperly trained before they came to the United States, they really had a hard time trying to find services and legal services to help them out. And just to kind of sum it up, because trafficking is facilitated by unjust global and national policies, solutions really have to be comprehensive, starting from the local level all the way to the global level. And so the following is a culmination of solutions that both staff workers and workers themselves want to see in the future. And so this is another quote of one of the workers saying that if the Philippines just did their job, invested in social services, then maybe I wouldn't have to migrate and be trafficked. And so organizationally, workers want to see more outreach and education on the rights of migrant workers, more research on what resources migrant workers currently have access to, continue legal services for TNU visas and immigration relief, build more partnerships between grassroots organizations and social service agencies, and involve migrant workers as leaders for mobilizations and campaigns. Locally, they want to educate the broader public more on human trafficking and what that means, because often we hear the word human trafficking but we don't know what that is. Train local law enforcement, enforce current labor protection laws like Domestic Workers' Bill of Rights. For example, in New York, they have the Domestic Workers' Bill of Rights, but they're still being exploited as domestic workers. So just passing the law is not enough. Nationally, they want more genuine immigration reform. They want labor protections. They want migrant workers to be legalized, and to end guest worker programs that bound workers to recruiters and employers. And then lastly, globally, they want labor protections for all workers around the globe. Did I repeat that? Oh, maybe. They want migrant workers to be educated about their rights before leaving home, end foreign labor recruitment schemes, increase social services and job opportunities in the Philippines to end forced migration. And just to move forward, I think this summer was really life-changing in that I never expected myself to be a researcher and just to be more of an organizer or just to work in the nonprofit field forever and never delve into the fields of research. But I think it was an amazing experience to see how research can be really community-based and community-led. And in terms of next steps, I'm planning to create an honors thesis more on the global policies and how it facilitates trafficking, and to continue my community work. And also just a quick plug, I mentioned that I went to a conference about international human rights and migration rights and refugee rights. We're going to be having a report back on that conference on October 29th from 8 to 10 p.m. in Okada Tea House, if you guys know where that is on campus. And then we'll be talking more about kind of resolutions and next steps of how we can help more migrant workers and refugees. But yes, thank you so much for listening.